So thank you, David, for that kind introduction, which brought back many memories. Thank you as well to Professor Kwok for having me here and for taking me out to lunch just now, and also to Jiyoung Lee for organizing all of this. It's wonderful to be back in Ann Arbor. It's always great to be here. I was last here in 2006 for the premiere of the film Koryo Saram at the Michigan Theater, which of course was produced by David and Michigan Korean Studies. And since I'm back here in Michigan, I figured I'd use Koryo Saram as a starting point for my talk, the hope being that all of you are familiar with the film since it was produced here, but David reminded me that was already 5 years ago, so maybe that's not the case, so I'll have to sort of summarize the film a little bit for y'all. As I'm sure at least some of you know, though, this very successful film was about the tragedy and perseverance of Kazakhstan's substantial Korean population, which refers to itself alternately as the Koryo Saram, Soviet Koreans, and Kazakhstani Koreans. The film did a brilliant job of presenting this community to Western audiences, providing an overview of Korean migration to Russia around the turn of the century, Korean participation in the early Soviet state, and then focusing in particular on Stalin's 1937. Stalin's 1937 deportation by rail of the Koreans from the Russian Far East, since he was worried that they might serve as Japanese spies, hence the subtitle, The Unreliable People. The film then turned to the Korean successful adaptation to the Soviet system, and then ended with the post-Soviet years, which has brought renewed contacts with the Korean peninsula, as well as opportunities to revisit and reconstruct notions of Korean culture. So as David just mentioned, 10 years ago, I spent a Fulbright year in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to study Soviet Korean culture. And in fact, as David mentioned, that was where he and I first met, which is odd considering that we're both Korean Americans from the DC area. We very easily could have met in Annandale, I guess, but no, it was in the German theater in Almaty. And it was back in DC in 2005 that David very kindly invited me to serve as a consultant for the Koryo Saram film, though I think my most substantial contribution to the project was delivering a fox fur hat from German Kim in Almaty to Mr. Nam here in Ann Arbor. Basically, this was an entire fox carcass converted into a hat. It was very long and sort of reached down to all the way down one's back, and so I hope that it served Mr. Nam well during the Michigan winters. Otherwise, my role involved mostly just talking with David and Matt Dibble, the editor, about my impressions of the Soviet Koreans and the ways I've tried to put this community into dialogue with Korean Americans. And I've just designed this lecture as a continuation of these discussions that David, Matt, and I had in 2005 and 2006 as they were shaping the narrative of the Koryo Saram film. The gist of these discussions and also of my interest in Soviet Koreans boils down to the following questions. How does this community enable us to rethink what it means to be Korean, and in particular, rethink the Korean diaspora? Despite the tragedy of Stalin's 1937 deportation from the Soviet Far East to Central Asia, might there be something redemptive or instructive about Soviet Korean history and culture? I guess a more pointed way of putting this question would be, is it possible to free the Koryo Saram, the Soviet Koreans, from the ghosts of Stalinism in 1937? And this points to the broader question driving my research as a whole. Is it possible to talk about 20th century communism without being hamstrung by discourses of totalitarianism? In 2012, is it possible to salvage anything positive from the anti-capitalist utopianism that once took root in places like Kazakhstan, Russia, China, and North Korea? The answer to all of these questions is a resounding yes. But before I try to convince you of this, I should tell you a little bit about my research. So as David mentioned, I teach in the English department at Cal, and my field is actually 20th century American literature. My first book, which David also talked about, which I'm now completing, is about American minority writers and artists who were drawn to the Soviet Union primarily in the 1920s and 30s. Figures like the African-American poets Claude McKay and Langston Hughes, and the Jewish-American philosophers Horace Kalin and Sidney Hook. The idea is that these minorities went to the Soviet Union looking for racial and ethnic equality, which many of them thought had been realized through communism. They believed, basically, in Moscow's promise of both eliminating racial discrimination and also promoting local languages and cultures. However, as anyone who's watched the Koryo Saram film knows, this promise was at best contradictory. The mass deportations of the 1930s and Soviet anti-Semitism from the 1940s onward belie any effort to think well of Soviet nationalities policy, the Soviet friendship of peoples, or multinationalist, mnogonationalist. And so what I argue in the book is that the American minorities who went to the Soviet Union weren't just looking for state policies about equality. Many of them were also looking for artistic inspiration. That is, the Soviet Union of the 1920s was the home not just of Soviet nationalities policy, but also of the Soviet Avant-Garde, represented by figures such as L. Lissitzky, Sergei Eisenstein, and Vladimir Mayakovsky, who are all still celebrated today as figures who were briefly able to merge art and life, artists who could legitimately call themselves revolutionaries. One thing I show in the book is that, in fact, the Soviet avant-garde was deeply interested in minority and non-Western cultures. And so, for instance, L. Lissitzky, now best known for suprematist works like Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge, also looked for ways of reconciling his Jewish roots with both revolutionary politics and formal experimentation. So, for instance, in this illustration, here we see Soviet power as the hand of God, striking down the angel of death on whom Lissitzky affixes a tsarist crown. So the Bolshevik Revolution here merges with Jewish messianism. Through the lens of the Soviet avant-garde, it becomes possible to reconcile ethnic particularism and international revolution. And my book focuses on how such counterintuitive Soviet visions enabled African American, Jewish American, and Asian American artists to arrive at new understandings of race, ethnicity, and nationality. Basically, my book argues that if you were an American minority artist or writer in the 1920s, by traveling to Moscow, you could suddenly imagine yourself as being at the forefront of both the international revolution as well as the international avant-garde. Through the Soviet Union, you could combine ethnic particularism, political radicalism, and artistic experimentation. And these three ingredients constitute what I call the ethnic avant-garde, which refers more to a particular kind of producing and writing art and literature than any kind of phenotype or skin color. The ethnic avant-garde is dependent on a set of aesthetic styles, techniques, and themes rather than the ethnicity or race of a given artist. For instance, I illustrate the ethnic avant-garde using Vladimir Tatlin's Never Realized Monument to the Third International. This constructivist tower was to have served as the administrative headquarters of the Communist International as it fomented revolution around the world. Revolutions from all countries and races were to have convened in the tower's meeting halls and editorial offices. And agitational radio was to have emanated from the tower's peak. So basically, the tower was intended as a machine for making revolution. Interestingly, however, and I can talk more about this during the Q&A, the tower also incorporates pre-modern myth through its clear reference to the Tower of Babel. And in the book, this pairing of a liberated future and a mythical past points to a vision of revolution able to accommodate multiple temporalities and multiple cultures and ethnicities. When we think of ethnicity, the term ethnicity, we usually think about the past, tradition, descent. When we think of the avant-garde, we usually think of the future, the new, progress. And so I've coined this term, the ethnic avant-garde, to capture a push and pull between past and future, between universalism and particularism, that define the Soviet avant-gardes, that helped to define the Soviet avant-gardes of the 1920s, and which today still points to new ways of thinking about both ethnicity and avant-gardism. And just to be perfectly clear, in coining this term, my secret mission is to rehabilitate the cross-racial, anti-capitalist solidarities that flourished in the early Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet project was an utter failure, but that doesn't mean we should stop looking for alternatives. To bring this back to the Koreans of Kazakhstan, what I'm doing in this talk is taking the notion of the ethnic avant-garde, again, this combination of ethnic particularism, political radicalism, and artistic experimentation, and applying it to the Koryo Saram, and then seeing what new narratives about this group we might be able to open up. And just to give you a sense of what I mean by this, as I told David as he was editing the Koryo Saram film, for me, the Koreans of Kazakhstan have always served to expand possibilities. And I think this is something implicit in the Koryo Saram film, that the Koreans of Kazakhstan really destabilize and expand what it means to be a Korean minority. So here we see one of the interviewees from the film, Sergei Yun, a model Soviet citizen, former director of a collective farm, who has now become a model post-Soviet capitalist. Accordingly, at the conference surrounding the 2006 screening here at Michigan, I gave a paper about Victor Tsoi, one of the Soviet Union's greatest rock stars, who happened to be half Korean and who's been claimed since his tragic death in 1990 as Korean both by local Koreans and also by South Koreans, even as a founder of South Korean rock. One of the speakers of that conference was Alexander Khan, a Kazakhstani Korean author who draws from Vladimir Nabokov in his efforts to fill in the perceived void of Soviet Korean identity. And so for someone like me who studies Asian American culture, such examples underscore the fact that notions of Koreanness are quite fluid and contingent. And for me, both personally and professionally, this has been very enabling over the years to have that perspective. By applying the framework of ethnic avant-gardism to the Koryo Saram, my goal is to articulate in a more systematic way precisely the sense I've long had that studying this group opens new, even utopian possibilities. That this group helps us to rethink both Korean identity, but also the role of racial and ethnic identity vis-a-vis 20th century revolution. There's one problem here, though. This framework of the ethnic avant-garde that I've just described is something I've developed by looking at Soviet and American artists, mostly interacting during the 20s and 30s. So for instance, I look at the African-American poet Langston Hughes's translation of Vladimir Mayakovsky's futurist poems about Africans in Cuba, and that was in the mid to late 1920s. Unfortunately, I don't know of any comparable interactions between Soviet and Korean artists in the 1920s and 30s. Also, I don't know of any Soviet Korean avant-gardists from that time. David, maybe you found something and we can talk after. All I have are a few scattered clues that avant-gardism might have some relevance for Soviet Koreans. And I actually first learned of these clues through David, and specifically through a 1946 documentary film that he found in Almaty and incorporated into the 2007 Koryo Saram film. Entitled Sunbong, or Avant-Garde in Russian, and in Russian they drop the T for avant-garde. This 30-minute documentary profiles actually 25-minute documentary profiles a Kazakhstani Korean collective farm by that name, an actually existing Kolkhoz entitled, that was called Sunbong/Avant-Garde. At first glance, the film is pure propaganda. Though produced in Almaty by a predominantly Russian crew just 9 years after the deportation in 1937, it presents this kolkhoz as a socialist utopia in which Koreans are free to study their language, read their own newspapers, celebrate their culture, and always exceed production quotas. The film begins with footage of tractors cultivating a once barren desert thanks to a newly constructed canal, all to the accompaniment of the Korean folk song Arirang. It concludes with Korean theater performers singing an ode to Stalin in Korean, and the narrator proclaiming that Stalin is a father to the Korean people. However, despite its obvious function as propaganda, and despite the fact that it was produced over a decade after the official adoption of Soviet socialist realism, and despite the fact that Sunbong means vanguard in the political rather than aesthetic sense, aesthetically it's actually quite interesting. And in a bit, I'm going to try to convince you that it harkens to some of the iconic images and techniques of the Soviet avant-garde of the 1920s and 30s. Independently of that lineage, however, one clear indication that this is an interesting film is that the 2007 Koryo Saram film incorporates many of its most striking images. We see this already in the opening titles of Koryo Saram, in which the act of preserving traditional Koryo Saram music leads to black and white footage of a Korean collective farm. The suggestion here is that this song provides an immediate entry point into Soviet Korean history, represented by that black and white footage. So let's take a look at this. I'll just show about 1 minute from the start of the 2007 film.
In 1937, Joseph Stalin signed a decree to deport every ethnic Korean living in Far East Soviet Russia, 4,000 miles away to the steppes of Central Asia. They called themselves Koryo Saram. Stalin called them the Unreliable People.
So basically, in that 1 minute clip, David has basically taken all of the best fragments from a 25-minute documentary and presented it as the opening titles for this film. But very striking shots. So all of this black and white footage comes from the 1946 documentary Avant-Garde. Again, this is ultimately a socialist realist propaganda film, but its appearance throughout Koryo Saram indicates that it might be more than propaganda, that it might provide at least a somewhat accurate and perhaps even ethnographic rendering of Soviet Korean life near the time of the deportation. And not just accurate, but again, very striking, which I'm guessing is one reason why David chose to use this footage in the Koryo Saram film. Images like these have a formal allure independent of the Stalinist political content. So for instance, in these examples, we see Korean subjects presented from a downward angle. The filmmakers experiment with camera angles in order to cast these farmers in a heroic light. Of course, one could argue that by 1946, this use of camera angle had become a convention of socialist realism. But elsewhere in the film, we see an emphasis on form which is actually quite unexpected. The camera lingers on electrical wires and the locks of a canal so as to accentuate the patterns that they create. And this is something one would expect to see in the 1920s and maybe the early 1930s rather than the mid-1940s in the context of the Soviet Union. That is, the turn to socialist realism in the early 30s was to have done away with what was referred to as formalism. Again, this kind of abstract emphasis on shapes, on pattern. Though perhaps in a place like Kazakhstan, which was very far removed from Moscow, there was still room to experiment. Maybe there was some wiggle room that artists, that filmmakers had still in the 1940s. Indeed, the film here is reminiscent of the constructivist photographer Aleksandr Rodchenko's work, specifically his 1933 presentation of the White Sea Canal in the magazine USSR in Construction. Here he accentuates the shapes and patterns of the canal, often through the use of skewed angles. Rodchenko's White Sea photos are now infamous since they used avant-garde techniques to glorify a Stalinist construction project built by prison laborers who had very little construction equipment and who died en masse in the harsh climate of northern Russia. Thousands and thousands of people died building this canal. Several have commented on this photo in particular, in which Rodchenko uses photo montage to equate Stalin with the canal and the transformation of nature. And so for many scholars, this marks the Soviet avant-garde's complete surrender to the Bolshevik vanguard. Rodchenko using constructivist techniques like photo montage to transfigure a brutal labor camp into something to be celebrated. Interestingly, the 1946 avant-garde film ends on a very similar note, with footage of a canal built during one of Stalin's 5-year plans and the narrator proclaiming that Stalin is the father of the Korean people. At the end of Avant-Garde, we also see 3 hero laborers, 1 Korean and 2 Kazakhs, looking out over the canal. Just as in Rodchenko's White Sea Canal project, we find this photo of Soviet leaders looking into the bright future opened by that canal. Okay, so far this has been a rather arcane academic exercise tying a 1933 Soviet magazine to a 1946 Soviet film, and this is the Center for Korean Studies. And basically what I'm doing is using Rodchenko as a tool to show that there's more to the 1946 film than meets the eye, that we can find in the film Avant-Garde some traces of the Soviet avant-garde of the 1920s and 30s. And so what do we do with that? Well, we could from there simply conclude that we should look at the 1946 film Avant-Garde just as we now look at Rodchenko's 1933 White Sea Canal photos as an instance of good art being pressed into the service of totalitarian politics, using interesting angles and techniques to conceal prison labor on one hand, here in 1933, and the 1937 deportation on the other in the 1946 film. From this perspective, the service provided by David Chung's 2000 film about the Koreans of Kazakhstan is that it highlights the history hidden by the 1946 film Avant-Garde. It takes us beneath the socialist realist veneer of that film to show the history of the deportation, as well as all of the sweat and blood that went into making the Koreans such a successful Soviet minority. And yet I would like to suggest that David's film hints at another possible narrative about the Koreans of Kazakhstan, one that doesn't rely on a clear divide between aesthetics and politics. And the key here is this image from Avant-Garde. As we just saw, David used this image, among others, for Koryo Saram's opening titles. Interestingly, this is also Koryo Saram's very last image before the closing credits. That is, this image of Soviet Koreans marching through fields behind a Soviet flag serves to frame the entire film. It is both the beginning and the ending. And it works very well with the film's final words, read by David as the film closes. The Koryo Saram never chose, maybe we can have David read it for us. The Koryo Saram never chose to give up their culture. They held on to it with resilience. Now they travel forward with this heritage as a reminder of their origin, just as the songs Yakov Khan records are echoes of the ghost trains and beyond. And the ghost trains refer to the trains that deported the Koreans in 1937 from the Russian Far East to Kazakhstan. In short, this image of Koreans as a Soviet vanguard captures this community not just in 1946, but also in the present and the future. They are moving forward into a post-Soviet future, and yet are marked by this Soviet past, including tragedies like the 1937 deportation, but also the failed utopia captured by this image. The notion that Koreans were once part of a revolutionary vanguard working with other nations to help further the cause of international socialism. What I'm suggesting here is that this image and David's centering of it invites us to see the Koryo Saram's Soviet past as more than just a tragedy. It invites us to reconsider the utopian aspirations undergirding the 1946 film. Though, of course, by 1946, this utopia had long become a Stalinist utopia. By Stalinist dystopia. By the 1933, the Soviet avant-garde was officially dead, and later in that decade, by 1937, the Soviet Friendship of Peoples had given way to mass deportations. Nonetheless, I think it's possible to salvage fragments from this failed utopia. And basically the exercise here is taking a film from 1946 and showing that in the context of 2012, we can reassemble it and find new meanings, even though in the context of 1946, yes, this is Stalinist propaganda. So taking David's use of it in 2007 as a kind of launching pad, maybe we can sort of formulate new narratives, which I'll try to do now. And partly with the help of, again, the Soviet avant-garde. Specifically, another example from 1933, the film 3 Songs About Lenin by the director Dziga Vertov, who was one of the pioneers of film montage along with Sergei Eisenstein. I have in mind particularly, again, this image of Koreans marching Soviet style to a Korean language song, which immediately brings to mind for me Vertov's portrayal of young communists in Uzbekistan. In 3 Songs About Lenin, near the opening of it, we see a column of Uzbek pioneers marching first to a generic Soviet song, but then we see them again marching to the tune of traditional Uzbek instruments. So let's take a look at this. I'll just show about 50 seconds of this. This clip encapsulates the promise of Soviet nationalities policy, that one could be national in form but socialist in culture, that you could be part of the world revolution but also maintain your distinct culture. At the very end of that clip, the camera pans out erratically as though to indicate a fundamental shift in perception. And this is followed by an Uzbek woman removing her traditional veil as though to open this new perception. The Soviet Union ruthlessly implemented an anti-veiling campaign in the 1920s and 30s in Central Asia. Nonetheless, in Three Songs About Lenin, we find one more instance of what I earlier called the ethnic avant-garde, that combination of modern and pre-modern, joining ethnic particularism, world revolution, and artistic experimentation. What I'm suggesting here is that the 1946 film Avant-Garde bears traces not just of Rodchenko, but also of Vertov, and that through this linkage between Three Songs and Avant-Garde, we're invited to think not just about formal and aesthetic qualities, but also about political content. Again, this utopian of a progressive multicultural society, which wasn't quite realized, but we have it here in these fragments. To recap so far, the starting point for this talk was the 2007 Koryo Saram film, which shatters the socialist realist veneer of the 1946 film Avant-Garde. However, I proceeded to connect the film Avant-Garde to the Soviet Avant-Garde, the goal being to redeem what at first glance is mere propaganda. To take another step back, what I've shown is that in these two documentary films about Soviet Koreans, one from 1946 and the other from 2007, we find two competing narratives. The 1946 narrative presents Soviet Koreans as living in a socialist paradise in which all races are joined in the cause of universal equality. The 2007 narrative reveals all that the 1946 narrative conceals. It highlights the tragedy but also perseverance of the Koryo Saram in the wake of both Stalinism and now socialism. However, in this closing and opening image, the 2007 narrative hints at other possibilities, a sense that maybe the utopianism of the 1946 narrative cannot be completely suppressed or forgotten, and in fact, that it's integral to Koryo Saram culture and identity. Even as the Koryo Saram are moving forward, there are still these rumblings from the past. I'm going to turn now and conclude by turning now to a contemporary Kazakhstani Korean video artist who takes up this narrative, who carries forward the final words of the film Koryo Saram, who takes as his point of departure this ghostly image of deported Koreans who are all victims of Stalinism, but also still active participants in the utopia that has failed them. The grandson of deportees, Aleksandr Ugay was born in 1978 in Kizilorda, trained as an engineer, and he now resides in Almaty. I'm going to show in full a 5-minute 2007 video entitled Bastion, which I read as a hybrid of the 1946 Avant-Garde and the 2007 Koryo Saram. And what I find most striking here is that this is a film fully cognizant of the horrors of the Soviet past. And yet there's a kind of utopian longing here, a nostalgia for that very past, and a texture, a graininess that belies our efforts to assign any single narrative to this branch of the Korean diaspora. So I'll play it, and then we can talk about it. So there are obviously many different ways we can read this melancholic piece. I, of course, was just so excited to see this for the first time earlier this month because Tatlin's Tower figures so centrally to my book and to my ways of thinking about ethnicity in the avant-garde. And so just out of the blue, this Kazakhstani Korean artist is making use of Tatlin's Tower in this 2007 piece. So I'm just... Anyway, so I was jumping up and down, obviously, when I saw this. And we've been in touch. He took the photos from a historical photo book from the early 1920s. And though it's hard to make them out, these photos include picnic scenes, not unlike picnic scenes from the 1946 film Avant-Garde, as well as an image of an airplane and images of old Soviet factories. And it was filmed at Lake Kapchagai, north of Almaty, using Super 8 film, and then transferred and sort of manipulated through digital means. For me, these photographs and these figures who are wandering around this landscape are trying to convey to us something from the past. I read these as ghosts from lost, failed utopias. The photos and landscape strike me as postcards from the Kolkhoz Sunbong or Avant-Garde, remnants of both the grand hopes underlying it, hopes that were exaggerated beyond belief in the 1946 socialist realist film. But we find here remnants as well of the tragedy underlying these hopes. There's a clear sense here of a utopia that was supposed to unfold in Kazakhstan, a kind of Korean, specifically Soviet Korean utopia that was supposed to unfold on the Kolkhoz Avant-Garde, but of course it failed to take root. I'll read you what Aleksandr has to say about this piece. What he wrote to me earlier this month was, I see the connection between the Soviet avant-garde and Kazakhstani Koreans in a different way. I think at that time, all the people who shared the ideas of socialism have been at the forefront of society. The Soviet Union was the first construction site of socialism on such a big scale. Kazakhstani Koreans are no exception. In addition, they were able to really build socialism in some farms that were named as Avant-Garde, Third International, and so on. In a sense, such forms as Third International, in the context of real practice, is more relevant than the abstract Third International of Tatlin. Unfortunately, many utopias ended in dictatorship or distorted ideas, but this does not mean they shouldn't be. For me, this video is a kind of nostalgia, not about the past, but about the future. What I find striking about these words, and also about the piece, at least in my readings, and I would love to hear what impressions you all have, is that they sort of mix a kind of revolutionary pathos, a very clear awareness of the tragedy of the Soviet Koreans in the 1937 deportation, along with, again, this strange idea of a nostalgia for the future, this kind of yearning for some kind of other narrative about Soviet Koreans, about the Soviet Union, and about the failed utopianism that this artist, at least, and again, it's very exciting to meet him, believes needs to be restored, this kind of utopian vision. Elsewhere, he wrote to me that there's a kind of political impasse because there is no alternative to capitalism. I don't know. I was telling David this yesterday. I don't know if this is a kind of post-socialist, post-Soviet artist sort of knowing the language that Western academics want to hear about alternatives and using this as a kind of marketing tool, because I find that quite a bit in China, in particular, contemporary China, a very skilled ability to use this kind of rhetoric to sort of frame works in a very sophisticated way. And so I'll meet him someday and find out. This is very much in line with works by scholars like the anthropologist Aleksandr Rodchenko at UC Berkeley, scholars who are interested in trying to rehabilitate or at least re-examine socialist societies in order to sort of parse out what might still be portable for the current day, how we might be able to articulate some sense of an alternative. This brings me back to discussions, to the discussions I had with David and Matt back in 2005 and 2006. Just this question that we kept on bouncing back and forward among ourselves. How can anything be redemptive here or instructive in the Soviet Korean experience? How can we see this as anything other than a tragedy to be overcome? Though certainly with a glimmer of hope, given just how scrappy and stalwart the Koreans have been in Kazakhstan. But my response at long last, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to articulate this earlier, David, is that it's hopefully through this framework that I'm calling the ethnic avant-garde, one that joined peoples of color all around the world, that we can talk about Soviet Koreans in relation to, say, Korean Americans and other minorities, all joined by this kind of very hopeful but ultimately failed vision. Writers and artists who sought to combine ethnic particularism, revolutionary politics, and artistic experimentation. A phenomena that in my work I mostly trace by looking at Soviet American interactions from the 1920s onwards, but one that is alive and well in the Korean diaspora, as we see in the work of, for instance, Aleksandr Rodchenko. So thank you.